Welcome to the Titan Games tutorial for changing a game save battery in a Game Boy game. Today we're going to be changing the game save battery in Pokemon Red, which takes a 2025 coin style battery here. Some of the things you're going to need is a soldering iron, obviously. You're also going to need some solder. I like some thinner gauge stuff here, as you can see. I think it's a little easier when working around small components. You're also going to need some desoldering wick, some rosin flux, which is not necessarily needed, but I prefer it for better connections. You're also going to need something to clean your soldering iron with. I like steel wool. A lot of people will use a wet sponge, which is perfectly fine. We also sell these 3.8 millimeter bits for taking off the screw on the back on the website. You're going to need a handle for it though, because it does not have one. A couple other things that you're going to need is some isopropyl alcohol and a little bit of patience and a steady hand. So with that, I'm going to heat up the soldering iron and let's get started. So first thing you want to do while the soldering iron is heating up is you're going to want to take apart the game. You just have to remove this one screw on the back here. You set that off to the side. And this front portion does a little slide down, and then you can remove it like that. Pretty simple. Set these off to the side. Looks like this battery has also been replaced at some point in its lifetime. I don't typically care for these solder connections here. As you will see, we're going to try to make ours a little bit cleaner. I have the rosin set off to the side, and the first thing we're going to do, and it's something you should do almost every time you use a soldering iron, is clean the tip. So you're going to put a little bit of solder on there. You're going to clean it off. And then the easiest way I like to get these batteries off is I will stick a nail underneath here, right? Heat up the solder on one leg and pull that leg up until the solder cools underneath that leg. So now you have one off. You could do the same thing for the other side. And there you have it. Now your old battery is off, ready to be recycled. And just a couple things I want to point out here. There's some very small components on this board, very close to the soldering pad. You want to be mindful of those. On this soldering pad, there's also a small component here that if you accidentally slip and that soldering iron hits this sucker, you can definitely knock it off the board, and you're not going to be happy about that. Can you put it back on? Yes. Is it easy? No. So try to be very careful and don't do that. So what we want to do now is remove this old solder. One of the easiest ways to do that is with some desoldering wick. Now, you're going to want to position yourself in a spot where you do not have this solder wick, because it's going to heat up when you put the iron on it, near this component. And what I like to do is start inside and work my way outside of the wick. I think it gives me a little bit more control. So you're just going to want to sandwich that in between the soldering iron and the existing solder, move it around a little bit, and that's it. You got that pad cleaned up. Looks pretty good. Let's do the other one. Like I said, move up a little bit, sandwich it in between until the solder underneath gets wet. This one is being a little stubborn, which it likes to do if the solder wick already has some solder on it. There we go. And if you're having some trouble with some old solder, a little tip would be to take some new solder and feed it into that pad. So wet the old solder, or try to wet the old solder and feed some new solder into there, and then it makes it a little bit easier to get that old stuff off. So now off camera here, I got a little pumper with some isopropyl alcohol. I have a Q-tip that I just wet the end And what I'm gonna do is take that isopropyl and clean off these two pads here. So we want a nice clean area to get a nice clean connection with the new battery. Look at that. Beautiful. So I'm going to set that Q-tip off to the side because I'm going to use it again later. And now we have here, it says battery CR 2025. Easy way to find out whatever game you're changing, the size battery that you need. We also have a positive and a negative marked clearly on the board here. As you can see on this battery, you have the positive on top, and that's where that leg's coming from, and then the bottom is negative, and this leg is attached to the negative side. So you want to make sure that you orient this battery in the correct position, which would be like this. Now, before we do that, I've taken a little bit of that soldering flux and put it on this piece of paper here. I'm going to put a little bit on this pad, and I'm going to put a little bit on this pad. It might be a little much, but that's all right. No big deal. We're going to clean it up after we're done. So let's put this puppy in. That soldering flux will help keep the battery in place a little bit too if those legs touch, but nah, they seem to be popping up, but that's all right. We're going to take care of that when we solder this battery in. So orient the board in a way that is easy for you to get the soldering iron in there, and in a manner in which you're not going to come in contact with those guys right there. So what I like to do is put a little bend on my solder, and I will hold this in position with one hand and put the soldering iron on a leg and the pad. You get it a tiny bit wet here, but then the idea is to touch the solder to the pad and let it flow to the soldering iron, just like that. And I'll put my finger on here to make sure that when the solder cools, the battery stays in place. Pretty simple. I'm gonna do the same thing to the other side. Put a little bend on the solder that we're going to be feeding in. We're going to put the soldering iron on both the leg and the pad. Give it a little tap, get some wet solder on there, and then feed it into the pad. See how I'm feeding the solder into the pad, not into the tip of the soldering iron. That looks like plenty. Now, there you have it. Brand new battery so that you can save your Pokemon games. I like to take this Q-tip and clean up this area a little bit after we're all done here. Get some of that excess flux off of there. And that's about it. Looks good.